The Consent Factory. Okay. Let me tell you, this year, one of my favorite authors, one of my favorite writers has been CJ Hopkins from Off Guardian and from The Consent Factory, which is his own website. Consent Factory, I think, .org. Consent Factory Inc. All right. And he has an article here talking about the Consent Factory. And it's really interesting because obviously that's the name of his website and his Twitter account for that website. Well, he's been talking a lot about narrative management and the Consent Factory, and the group of people that are trying to set the narrative that everybody technically believes is a knowledge base of fact. And it's really interesting. Let me go back here. I don't want to get to that yet. In 2000, let's call it 14, 15, I was not that politically awake. I was still sort of figuring out that Obama wasn't going to get anything done. I was still kind of saying, well, it was the Republicans and the corporate Democrats that really did it to him, not realizing that he himself was also a corporate Democrat that did it intentionally. That's because of the Consent Factory. And it took a huge awakening and in unplugging and a relearning and a tearing down of everything that I had effectively learned to understand just how badly we've been screwed over and lied to and how much for-profit system took over our media. And some people still haven't figured that out. They still think that the media is genuinely good. They still think that they're trying to do good things, and it's not all in the name of profit. They think that profit's important. Yeah, sure. But they still think that the media companies put good first and profit second, or at least put them on equal footing, where they don't even realize that good is not even in the equation anymore. It's just about ratings and about if it bleeds, it leads, and controversy sells, and clickbait sells, and big names sell, and emptiness and vapidness and selling the lie is what sells. And as long as you go along with that narrative, you're going to be well taken care of. And this is what CJ Hopkins has been talking about for a long time. He's been one of these people that's like been saying, I'm giving the system the finger, and I'm telling you what's happening and why I'm giving the system the finger, and that I'm giving the system the finger. And I want you all to join me. And I love him, and I've started to do the same. So join us here. So now here, what happened was Matt Taibbi is now going to go after the Consent Factory. So no, not his blog, and the actual Consent Factory, the unimaginably powerful, mostly decentralized global capitalist propaganda apparatus that manufactures what passes for reality, quote unquote, in our increasingly totalitarian age. Or he's going after the U.S. division of it anyway. Needless to say, I'm pretty excited. And that's CJ, but so am I, Indy. Why I'm so excited? Why am I so excited, you ask? Well, haven't I been hopping up and down and bouncing off the walls of my enclosure, hooting and screeching about how the so-called Twitter files are a limited hangout and hurling verbal feces at all and sundry involved like an agitated baboon? Well, yes, in fact, I have. And I intend to keep on doing that, but here's what I'm excited about. Pay close attention to the job description in Matt's recent Help Wanted ad for Freelancers, which he put out on Racket News. Quote, we're trying to map a new wing of the U.S. government's propaganda apparatus that popped into view thanks to the Twitter files. State-directed censorship is scary, but the more disturbing activity we're seeing inside companies like Twitter involves what you might call offensive information operations, a type of aggressive official messaging that all governments practice, but is supposed to be restricted by law in the United States. That goes on to explain the background of the project, that, quote, in a remarkably short time since the end of the Obama presidency, the U.S. government has funded an elaborate network of NGOs and think tanks whose researchers call themselves independent, quote, disinformation experts, like Hamilton 68. They describe their posture as defensive, merely tracking or countering foreign disinformation, but in truth, they aggressively court both the domestic news media and platforms like Twitter, often becoming both the sources for news stories and or the referring authorities for censorship requests. The end result has been relentless censorship of and mountains of, often deceptive, state sponsored propaganda about legitimate American political activity. Oh, God, I love these guys. The two of them are just wordsmiths. Okay, sure. Matt's Racket News Project will almost certainly be limited in scope to operations in the U.S. and will probably still be a limited hangout to the degree that it presents a propaganda slash disinformation slash censorship model wherein power flows downward from the U.S. government to the corporate media and social media corporations in the outmoded, despotic, like Orwellian fashion that everyone's used to understanding the functioning of oppressive power according to. And I'll definitely hoot and screech about that. However, at least as far as I'm aware, this project will be the first attempt by any high profile independent journalist to investigate and report on an essential component of the aforementioned official propaganda apparatus in any kind of systematic manner. Systematic being the important term here, as we're talking about a cohesive system, not a series of arbitrary individual actions. What's he talking about? Or at least that's what it sounds like Matt has in mind. So if Matt and the Racket team pull this off, it'll be quite a journalistic accomplishment, which will be totally ignored, perfunctorily dismissed, branded far-right disinformation, and then methodically visibility filtered by the official propaganda and disinformation apparatus that the project intends to expose a part of. Of course, naturally. That is, unless they're extremely careful and restrict their reporting to certain designated areas within the Consent Factory campus, in which case, well, you know, awards, book deals, television appearances, the whole 9 yards. I also, like CJ, like and respect Matt, and we'd like to see that happen for him. So I want to do what I can to help. I'm not a researcher and infographic designer, but I thought I could point some no-go zones that Matt and his team will need to avoid if they want to preserve any chance in hell of not being formally excommunicated from the Church of Seriousness and cast out into the outer darkness of the Nethernet, where David Icke and Alex Jones hang out and you don't show up on Google searches. Like this. This is an article that I covered and read with Fee not a week and a half ago from Consent Factory that also was picked up in Off Guardian. Off Guardian has been deemed by NewsGuard to not be a credible source of information. So, okay, the first thing and most important thing that Matt and his team will need to avoid is the fact that U.S. government is not what has been waging a global war on dissent and a global war on populism and conducting a global Gleichschaltung campaign whereby societies throughout the world are being ideologically synchronized and purged of any and all forms of deviance from global capitalist ideology since approximately the summer of 2016. It might even go back further than that, but that's about when I started noticing it too. So they'll need to stick to the domestic U.S. story and ignore all that global capitalism stuff, which, okay, that could get kind of awkward given the existence of the rest of the world and maybe the influence of the rest of the world on U.S. politics. And a guy like George Soros, who I believe lives in Austria or somewhere in Europe, having heavy influence on U.S. politics through open society. So in order to successfully ignore all that stuff, which knowing Matt, he'll be tempted to delve into, they'll absolutely need to commit to not hiring a slew of international researchers and convincing Elon to grant them access to the global Twitter files from countries like the UK, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Australia, Canada, etc., so they can report on how the global capitalist propaganda apparatus operated in virtually perfect lockstep globally from 2020 to 2022 and is still operating in virtually perfect lockstep globally right this very minute. I've done reports on a couple of these stories where, thanks to the Associated Press and Reuters, they literally can have the exact same story on every social network and every major network within minutes of each other around the world. It's really weird. That means they'll need to give a wide berth to the official COVID pandemic narrative and all the government and corporate propaganda and visibility filtering connected therewith, which was clearly a global enterprise of which the US government was only one part. Really? Yeah. They will need to pretend that some sort of Chinese wall exists. That's funny. Between the stories of the PSYOP commonly known as Russiagate, aka the war on populism, and the PSYOP commonly known as the pandemic, and report on the former as if the latter had almost nothing to do with the former, and were not an extension and evolution of the former, whereas the former was an extension of the war on terror, which they also need to give a wide berth to, or else the history of the last 33 years might end up looking like the evolution of some globally hegemonic system, like, for example, global capitalism, towards some ultimate totalitarian morphology. Wow, that's a mouthful. Yeah. Basically, they'll need to avoid the whole global capitalism thing entirely and report their story as if the world were comprised of competing sovereign nation states that were acting in their own national interests and for the benefit of their citizens, and so on, and not just a bunch of interdependent global capitalist administrative entities staffed by fascist maniacs and greedy half-witted functionaries who couldn't care less about their fellow citizens, much less their so-called democratic rights, and who would gladly establish a global market for their children's organs if they knew and they thought they could get away with it. Opening that can of worms would lead them straight into the heart of the consent factory. Again, not my little blog, but the decentralized, supranational network of governments, global corporations, NGOs, that's non-governmental governing entities, financial behemoths, corporate and state media, the majority of the culture industry, etc. Once inside, they could get lost in there forever, crawling down rabbit holes, pulling at strings, unraveling something that can never be unraveled, or not completely in any event, and which most people don't want to see unraveled. Not even just a little bit, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Tom Hanks. And soon you start to see it everywhere. And before you know it, you end up raving about the CIA assassinating Kennedy, thank you, Laurie Spencer, or NATO blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines, thank you, Cy Hirsch, or neo-Nazis in Ukraine, thank you, Alex Rubinstein, or whatever. Another area that Matt and his Racket team, of course, will need to, that was really funny. Before I continue, that was literally like a line or a section out of a Jesse Jet song. That sounded like it belonged right at a Red Pill. Before you know it, you end up raving about it everywhere. You see propaganda elevating even in sitcom banter. Yes, I love Jesse so much. Shout out Jesse Jet. If you can follow jessejet.bandcamp.com. I love that man at that. He's absolutely phenomenal. Brilliant genius. This week he wrote a piece on East Palestine that everybody should read, share. We put it on Twitter. It's got 5,000 plus views already. Let's get back to the story. Another area that Matt and his Racket team will need to studiously avoid when digging through the Twitter files that Elon Musk is granting them unrestricted and unconditional access to. I say that laughing because it's all vetted through legal counsel anyway, so it's not really unrestricted or unconditional access to any of it. It's any evidence of how new free speech Twitter is continuing and actually intensifying its visibility filtering of political speech, especially political speech that doesn't fit neatly into a red-blue paradigm, or that reminds the public about how the COVID PSYOP was a global PSYOP that was rolled out all at once globally, and not just a series of well-intentioned overreactions and mistakes and so on, where the media just got it wrong. And here's the same thing where Twitter is putting a warning because it has sensitive content, and then he puts literally P.T. Barnum's thing. Oh, that's also sensitive. Feels like Elon Musk is trying to tell us something. That's also sensitive. They're putting visibility filters on everything from Consent Factory. So reporting on Twitter's current and intensified censorship and VF activities, and whichever other entities are currently involved therewith, will only detract from the reporting on Twitter's former censorship and visibility filtering activities and the other entities involved therewith, and confuse people and leave them feeling hopeless and depressed and suspicious of the actual motives of its owner, a billionaire military intelligence community contractor. Oh, I love him. I know Matt, so I know it'll be hard for him to resist the temptation to delve into all these forbidden areas of inquiries and no-go zones and stick to the past tense domestic story, but as a friend and colleague who's been consigned to the aforementioned ignominious nethernet, I would urge him to exercise some self-discipline and refrain from any such reckless delving. That's interesting. He's not going to do anyone any good by going full Howard Beale on Substack and getting himself and Glenn Greenwald horridly machine gunned to death on System Update by Global Cap sponsored Bolsonaran guerrillas. True. And the story he's setting out to report will be a big, fat, big titted hit in itself. There's no need to go after the entire consent factory and depress the living hell out of everyone. After all, that's what blogs like CJ's Consent Factory are for.